George Clooney spent years saying he would never get married again. It became part of who he was. Hollywood's favorite bachelor. The man with the smile, the jokes, the motorcycles, the beautiful homes, and a life that looked effortless from the outside. Then Amal Alamuddin walked into his world, and everything changed. Almost overnight, George became a husband, then a father, and eventually a man who seemed very different from the one everyone thought they knew. But one person had watched that transformation from much closer than the public ever could. Brad Pitt had known George long before Amal arrived. And what Brad appeared to notice was not just a love story. It was something much deeper. What happens when the charm that carried you through life is no longer enough? Before Amal, George had turned being single into a lifestyle people admired. It wasn't simply that he avoided marriage. He made it look exciting. He always seemed relaxed, funny, and completely in control. Every interview was full of humor. Every appearance looked effortless. People assumed he had figured life out. But close friends often see what cameras cannot. Brad had watched George long enough to understand that the jokes were more than entertainment. They were protection. If George kept everyone laughing, nobody looked too closely at what he was keeping hidden. But what was he really avoiding? Their friendship grew during the Ocean's movies. Audiences loved their chemistry. The cast laughed constantly. The stories of practical jokes became legendary. George could brighten an entire movie set without trying. He made long filming days feel lighter. He teased people without crossing the line. He could walk into any room and immediately become the center of it. Yet when filming ended and the crowds disappeared, George became much harder to read. That contrast never escaped Brad's attention. Was the carefree image the whole story, or was something missing? George had already experienced one failed marriage with Talia Balsam. After their divorce in 1993, he repeatedly insisted he would never marry again. Over the years, he dated several well-known women. His relationships attracted headlines and endless speculation. But none of them lasted. To the public, it looked like George simply enjoyed his freedom. To someone like Brad, it may have looked different. Perhaps George wasn't afraid of love itself. Perhaps he was afraid of what love demanded once the excitement faded. And then something happened that nobody expected. In the summer of 2013, George was relaxing at his home near Lake Como when a mutual friend asked if they could bring someone over. George agreed without thinking much about it. That visitor was Amal Alamuddin. She wasn't arriving to meet a movie star. She was simply passing through Italy. Yet that casual meeting quietly changed the direction of George's life. What surprised people wasn't only that they met. It was how quickly George himself began to change afterward. At first, George behaved exactly as everyone expected. He joked. He stayed calm. He acted as though nothing unusual was happening. But friends who knew him well could hear something different beneath the confidence. This wasn't another casual romance. Amal didn't seem impressed by fame. She wasn't dazzled by red carpets or celebrity circles. She had built her own respected career and her own purpose long before meeting George. For perhaps the first time in years, George couldn't rely on his usual charm. So what did he do instead? Instead of trying harder to impress her, George listened. Their connection grew through conversations, emails, and long-distance communication before they finally met again in London. It wasn't simply romance that drew them together. George seemed to realize that the life he had defended for decades no longer felt complete. Amal wasn't asking him to become someone else. Yet somehow, simply by being herself, she challenged him to grow beyond the image he had carefully built. When George proposed in 2014, many people could hardly believe it. This was the same man who had spent years joking that marriage was never happening again. Yet there he was, nervous, waiting for Amal's answer. George Clooney rarely looked uncertain. But love has a way of making even the most confident people vulnerable. Maybe that was the biggest sign that this relationship was different all along. Their wedding in Venice became one of Hollywood's most celebrated events. The canals, the boats, the elegant guests, and the romance created the perfect picture. But those closest to George weren't focused on the spectacle. They noticed something quieter. Standing beside Amal, George didn't look like the untouchable movie star everyone admired. He looked peaceful. As if he had finally stopped running from something he couldn't quite name. But weddings are only the beginning. What happens after the celebration ends? 3 years later, George and Amal welcomed twins, Ella and Alexander. Fatherhood transformed George in ways fame never could. His life had always followed his own schedule. Film shoots, travel, premieres, late dinners, and endless freedom. Suddenly, none of that mattered when 2 small children needed him at the same time. Sleepless nights replaced glamorous routines. Diapers replaced award ceremonies. It was a completely different world. Brad reportedly found the adjustment amusing at first. Seeing George worry about diapers and bedtime was almost impossible to imagine after decades of bachelor life. But beneath the laughter, there was something touching. George wasn't pretending to enjoy family life for public appearances. He genuinely wanted to become the husband and father his family deserved. Still, wanting something and mastering it are rarely the same thing. Could George really leave his old habits behind? Amal's own career remained demanding. Her work in international law and human rights continued at the highest level. George's career still pulled him toward Hollywood, film sets, interviews, and premieres. Every place he visited expected the familiar George Clooney. Funny. Relaxed. Charming. But home asked for something completely different. It asked for patience, consistency, and emotional presence. Those qualities can't be performed. They have to be lived every single day. George once mentioned that he and Amal rarely argued. Many people saw that as proof of a perfect marriage. Others might wonder if every couple truly avoids conflict. Brad had lived enough life to understand that silence isn't always simple. Sometimes it reflects deep understanding. Other times, it means difficult conversations are waiting for another day. The real challenge wasn't whether George and Amal disagreed. It was how they handled those moments when life became complicated. George had spent years solving uncomfortable situations with humor. If something became emotional, he made everyone laugh. If things grew tense, he changed the subject. Those instincts worked wonderfully in Hollywood. Marriage, however, often asks for something different. Amal's world demanded honesty, direct conversations, and accountability. George couldn't simply entertain his way through family life. He had to stay present, even when it wasn't easy. But another friendship quietly reminded him of the man he used to be. George and Julia Roberts shared one of Hollywood's most famous friendships. Their chemistry stretched across multiple films and decades of shared experiences. Around Julia, everything seemed effortless. They understood the strange pressures of fame because both had lived through them. They laughed easily. They shared memories that stretched back years. That comfort led many people to invent stories that never existed. But was there another explanation? Julia represented George's old world. The familiar rhythm of movie sets, inside jokes, and a life built around Hollywood. Amal represented something entirely different. Family. Responsibility. Purpose beyond fame. Neither relationship canceled the other. They simply reflected different chapters of George's life. Around Julia, he could briefly remember the carefree bachelor everyone loved. Around Amal, he faced the man he needed to become. During the filming of Ticket to Paradise in Australia, speculation returned. Julia spent months away from her own family. George brought Amal and their children. Their lives overlapped during production, and gossip quickly followed. Yet Julia herself later spoke warmly about spending time with the Clooney family. Amal welcomed her. The children knew her. The friendship wasn't hidden from anyone. Still, Hollywood rarely leaves genuine friendships alone. Every smile becomes evidence. Every laugh becomes another theory. But what if everyone was asking the wrong question? Brad had watched enough public relationships to understand how quickly private lives become public entertainment. He knew photographs never tell the whole story. Looking at George and Amal, he likely didn't see perfection. He saw two people building a real life together while carrying enormous public expectations. George clearly loved Amal. That wasn't the mystery. The deeper question was whether he could continue becoming the man she inspired him to be long after the excitement of falling in love had faded. That may be the real story behind George Clooney's marriage. Not a hidden scandal. Not a secret love triangle. Not some shocking revelation. Amal became the first person who inspired George to choose something bigger than the image he had spent decades protecting. She didn't fall in love with Hollywood's favorite bachelor. She fell in love with the man behind the smile. And George had to decide whether he was willing to let that man finally be seen. Brad understood that transformation better than most because he knew what it felt like to have the world believe it understood your private life. He recognized the difference between headlines and reality. George wasn't simply learning how to be a husband. He was learning how to stop hiding behind the version of himself everyone expected. Today, George and Amal remain one of Hollywood's most watched couples. Their marriage continues to face the same pressures that come with fame, family, careers, and public attention. But perhaps perfection was never the goal. Real relationships aren't built by avoiding challenges. They're built by choosing each other again and again when life becomes ordinary, exhausting, and complicated. Maybe that's what Brad saw all along. George's greatest challenge was never getting married. It was staying emotionally present after marriage removed all the places he once hid. Amal didn't take away his freedom. She showed him that real freedom comes from having the courage to stop pretending. Julia wasn't the threat many imagined. She simply reminded George of the life he once lived before responsibility changed everything. In the end, this isn't really a story about Hollywood gossip. It's a story about identity. About choosing between being admired by millions or truly known by one person. George Clooney made that choice the day Amal walked into his home near Lake Como. And every day since then, he has continued making it. Because lasting love isn't about finding perfection. It's about becoming someone willing to grow long after the fairy tale ends.